The question hit me unexpectedly, though in retrospect, it shouldn't have. Did you like the Rolex watch Mom gave you as a gift last year? My mother's voice was casual, almost teasing, but there was an undercurrent I could feel, a subtle weight behind the words that made the simple question feel like an accusation. The dinner table was full of family chatter, clinking silverware, and the hum of conversation, but in that moment, everything seemed to shrink, focused entirely on me. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe. Your one tap truly motivates me to keep creating for you. I paused, letting her words linger in the air. The watch had been a gift, yes, but it had also been the center of endless comparisons and remarks. My sister, who had a knack for subtle digs, had once pointed out the cost, as if its value somehow measured my worth, my capability, or my standing within the family. My parents, knowingly or not, had allowed those remarks to shape the narrative, turning what should have been a gesture of affection into a silent test of compliance and gratitude. I looked down at my plate, letting the question sink in. I could feel the eyes of my father, the faint glances of my siblings, all expecting a carefully measured response. To say I liked it, or to express any genuine enthusiasm, might fuel the same dynamics that had always played out in our family. The gift, they seemed to believe, wasn't just a token of generosity. It was a tool, a reminder of control, a measure of how well I conformed to their expectations. Inside, I felt a swirl of emotion, discomfort, frustration, and the familiar sting of being assessed under impossible standards. But I knew better than to react impulsively. Years of family scrutiny had taught me that silence, observation, and subtlety often carried far more power than argument or confrontation. I could let the question hang, allow them to read into my pause, and retain the quiet authority that came from not being manipulated by their assumptions. The Rolex on my wrist, polished and gleaming, was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of the intersection between affection and expectation, a tangible representation of the complex dynamics that had always defined my place in this family. And as I consider my response, I realized that this moment, like so many before it, was less about the watch itself and more about the power, control, and perception embedded in the smallest of gestures. I met my mother's gaze briefly, a small, deliberate acknowledgement, and prepared myself. The moment was set, the room attentive, and the stage was mine to navigate carefully with patience, strategy, and quiet awareness. This dinner, and her question, would not define me, but how I handled it could quietly shift the balance she had assumed she controlled. After my mother's question, the atmosphere at the table felt suddenly charged, like a quiet storm waiting to break. I kept my composure, listening to the background chatter while my mind cataloged every nuance, the way my sister's eyes flicked toward me, the subtle tension in my father's jaw, the faint tilt of my mother's head as she awaited my response. The Rolex wasn't just a watch. It had become a symbol of control, an unspoken test designed to measure my reactions and loyalty. Their intent was clear, to gauge whether I would express gratitude, hesitation, or dissent, and to adjust their perception of me accordingly. I observed the patterns carefully. My sister had always been quick to point out my shortcomings in subtle ways, undermining my achievements and creating a hierarchy in which she occupied the top position. The gift, ostensibly generous, was another layer of that hierarchy, a tangible marker meant to remind me of my place. I realized that any immediate answer could be used against me. Complimenting the watch too much would seem sycophantic. Dismissing it would be interpreted as ingratitude, and hesitating would confirm their worst suspicions. I had to tread carefully. I decided to let silence do the work for me. I focused instead on the space around me, observing the family dynamics unfold. My mother, usually composed, showed subtle impatience. a flicker of frustration as she expected a certain type of response. My sister's smirk, meant to assert dominance, was fragile under my calm scrutiny. My father, attempting neutrality, had an almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, revealing that my controlled response was already unsettling the hierarchy they had worked to establish. Over the course of the meal, I began to weave subtle assertions into ordinary conversation. When my achievements came up, I spoke confidently yet without arrogance, grounding my remarks in fact and calm observation. When my sister tried to interject with sarcastic commentary, I allowed her words to pass, choosing instead to let the audience, the rest of the family and guests, absorb the contrast between her attempts at control and my composed presence. Every small detail I emphasized, every measured word I spoke, was designed to shift the narrative without confrontation. By the time dessert arrived, the shift was tangible. The room, previously attuned to my mother's test, now registered a different energy, quiet authority, subtle confidence, and undeniable competence radiating from me. My sister's smirk faltered, replaced by unease as she realized her attempts to dominate the conversation and control perception were failing. My parents, whose approval had always weighed heavily on me, now regarded me with cautious acknowledgement. The Rolex, the initial focal point of control, had become irrelevant, its intended power nullified by my strategic presence and composure. I could see the moment clearly, the turning point where the family's assumptions about my reaction and behavior no longer held. They had expected a controlled response, one they could interpret and manipulate. Instead, they received quiet, deliberate authority. Every glance, every word, every subtle gesture communicated that my worth, my independence, and my voice were not contingent on approval, gifts, or hierarchy. That evening, the dinner became a subtle battleground in which silence, observation, and deliberate action outweighed the power of manipulation and expectation. I had transformed what could have been humiliation into an opportunity to assert control and demonstrate resilience. The Rolex, once a symbol of testing and hierarchy, now lay beside me only as a watch, no longer a marker of power or influence. By the end of the night, the dynamic had shifted permanently. I had not argued, not yelled, not demanded acknowledgement. I had observed, calculated, and acted with precision. My presence alone dismantled the subtle power plays that had always dictated the family's interactions. And for the first time, I felt the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming authority without a single dramatic confrontation, proving that composure, patience, and strategy could achieve what anger and argument never could. By the time the dinner ended, the subtle shift in the room was undeniable. My sister's smugness had faltered, replaced by uncertainty. My parents, who had expected compliance or defensiveness, now looked at me with cautious acknowledgement. I hadn't raised my voice or argued. My calm presence and measured words had spoken louder than any confrontation could. The Rolex, once meant to test or manipulate me, no longer carried power. Its value was irrelevant beside the quiet authority I had demonstrated. I had shown that composure, observation, and deliberate action could dismantle manipulation and assert respect without drama. In that moment, I realized that my worth was not defined by gifts, hierarchy, or tests. It existed independently, undeniable, and unshakable.